Marcus Williams never expected to inherit his grandfather's lakeside property at age 32. The old man had been stubborn and independent until the very end, living alone in the weathered cabin overlooking Crystal Lake. When the lawyer called about the will, Marcus thought it was some kind of mistake. He worked as an accountant in the city and had barely spoken to his grandfather in years. The property came as a complete surprise. Sitting on 12 acres of prime lakefront land, it included a small cabin, a boat dock, and what appeared to be a well-maintained fishing area. Marcus drove out on a Saturday morning to see what he had inherited, expecting to find a rundown shack that would need to be sold quickly. What he discovered instead was a beautiful piece of land with crystal-clear water and towering pine trees. The cabin needed some work, but the bones were solid. More importantly, the location was stunning. Marcus could see why his grandfather had loved this place so much. As he walked around the property, he noticed several expensive fishing boats tied up at various points along his shoreline. That's when he encountered them. 5 men in their 50s and 60s, all wearing matching fishing vests and baseball caps, were setting up elaborate fishing equipment right on his beach. They had coolers, folding chairs, and what looked like a permanent setup. When Marcus approached and politely introduced himself as the new property owner, their reaction shocked him. The apparent leader, a heavy-set man named Chuck, barely looked up from his tackle box. He grunted something about how they had been fishing this spot for 15 years and weren't planning to stop now. Another man, wearing an expensive watch and designer sunglasses, laughed and said Marcus looked too young to own property anyway. They treated him like an annoying kid who had wandered into their private club. Marcus explained that this was his inherited property, and he would appreciate it if they asked permission before using his beach and dock. The men exchanged knowing looks and smirks. Chuck finally stood up, towering over Marcus by several inches, and suggested that maybe the city boy should head back where he came from. The others chuckled and went back to their fishing as if Marcus didn't exist. Walking back to his car, Marcus felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. He had been nothing but polite, yet these men had dismissed him completely. They acted like they owned the place, not him. As he drove home, he couldn't stop thinking about their arrogant attitudes and the way they had looked right through him when he tried to talk to them. That evening, Marcus called his cousin Jake, who lived in the area and might know something about the situation. Jake confirmed that the fishing group had indeed been using the property for years. His grandfather had been too old and tired to deal with them, especially after his grandmother passed away. According to Jake, the group had gradually become more bold and entitled, treating the property like their personal fishing resort. Marcus spent the rest of the weekend researching property laws and his rights as a landowner. He discovered that he had every legal right to control access to his property. The men were essentially trespassing, regardless of how long they had been doing it. But he also learned that dealing with squatters and people who felt entitled to use private property could be complicated and frustrating. By Sunday night, Marcus had made a decision. He wasn't going to let a group of arrogant men push him around and steal the use of his property. His grandfather had worked hard his entire life to own this land, and Marcus wasn't about to let it be taken advantage of by people who thought they could bully him into submission. The next weekend, Marcus returned to the property with a clear plan in mind. He was going to give these men one more chance to be reasonable. If they continued to treat him with disrespect and refused to acknowledge his property rights, he would take action. He had no idea just how stubborn and entitled this fishing club would prove to be, or how far he would need to go to reclaim what was rightfully his. Marcus arrived at Crystal Lake early Saturday morning, hoping to catch the fishing group before they got too settled in their routine. Sure enough, all 5 men were already there, unloading even more equipment than the previous weekend. They had brought a portable generator, electric fish cleaning station, and what appeared to be enough gear for a week-long camping trip. This time, Marcus was prepared. He had printed copies of his property deed and inheritance documents. He approached the group with confidence, determined to establish clear boundaries. Chuck looked up with obvious annoyance as Marcus walked over, as if he were being interrupted during something important. Marcus politely but firmly explained that he needed them to respect his property rights. He showed them the legal documents proving his ownership and asked them to please make arrangements to fish elsewhere. He even offered to give them time to find another location, suggesting they could finish out the month but would need to find somewhere else after that. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Chuck laughed loudly and called over the other men to look at the little lawyer with his papers. A thin man named Earl made jokes about city people who didn't understand how things worked in the country. The man with the expensive watch, who Marcus learned was called Big Jim, suggested that maybe Marcus didn't understand that they had grandfather rights to fish this spot. When Marcus explained that no such rights existed and that they were technically trespassing, Big Jim's demeanor changed completely. He stepped closer to Marcus and in a threatening tone suggested that Marcus might want to be careful about making accusations. Chuck joined in, saying they had been fishing this lake since before Marcus was probably born, and no piece of paper was going to change that. The situation escalated quickly. The group began talking among themselves as if Marcus wasn't there, making loud comments about property taxes, upkeep costs, and how the land would probably be back on the market soon anyway. Earl mentioned something about young people never sticking with country properties because they were too much work. Marcus realized these men had no intention of respecting his property rights or treating him with basic courtesy. They had already decided he was some kind of temporary inconvenience who would eventually give up and go away. Their entire attitude was based on the assumption that they could simply wait him out. Before leaving, Marcus made one final attempt at reasonableness. He offered to let them continue fishing if they were willing to pay a modest daily fee and follow some basic rules about cleanup and respect for the property. The suggestion was met with outright laughter. Big Jim told Marcus that he had a lot of nerve trying to charge them for something they had been doing for free for 15 years. Chuck delivered what he clearly thought was the final word on the subject. He told Marcus that they would continue fishing there whenever they wanted, and if he didn't like it, he could call the police. But he warned that the local sheriff was Big Jim's brother-in-law, and they all went to the same church and belonged to the same organizations in town. Marcus was essentially being told that he had no local support and no way to enforce his property rights. As Marcus walked back to his car, he could hear the men laughing and making jokes about him. He overheard Chuck saying something about teaching the city boy a lesson about how things really worked. Earl mentioned that Marcus would probably give up and sell the property within a year, just like they had hoped the old man would do. Driving home, Marcus felt a burning anger that surprised him with its intensity. These men weren't just trespassing on his property. They were actively trying to intimidate and humiliate him. They had made it clear that they considered themselves above his property rights and above common courtesy. That week, Marcus began researching his options more thoroughly. He discovered that property rights were indeed enforceable, even in small towns with local politics. He also learned about various legal remedies available to property owners dealing with trespassers who refused to leave voluntarily. Marcus also started thinking more strategically about the situation. If these men wanted to play hardball and use local connections to try to intimidate him, he would need to be smarter and more determined than they expected. He began developing a plan that would force them to respect his property rights, whether they wanted to or not. By Friday, Marcus had made several important phone calls and done extensive research into local ordinances and state laws. He was no longer thinking about compromise or accommodation. The fishing club had made their position clear, and now Marcus was ready to make his position equally clear. The weekend was going to be very different from the previous two. Saturday morning brought a surprise that changed everything. Marcus arrived at his property to find not just the usual 5 men, but nearly a dozen people spread across his beach and dock area. They had invited friends and family members for what appeared to be a fishing tournament or club event. There were women setting up picnic tables, children running around, and multiple boats tied up to his dock. The scene looked like a private resort or public park, not someone's private property. Trash was scattered around, and someone had driven tire tracks across his grass by driving a truck too close to the water. The group had clearly decided to escalate their use of his property, rather than respect his request to leave. Marcus parked and walked over to Chuck, who was grilling burgers on a portable barbecue grill. Chuck saw him coming and announced loudly to the group that the landlord had arrived. This generated laughter and comments from people Marcus had never seen before. He felt like an unwelcome outsider on his own property. This time, Marcus had brought backup. His cousin Jake and 2 of Jake's friends had agreed to come along as witnesses and moral support. Marcus had also brought a camera to document exactly what was happening on his property. He wanted a clear record of the situation before taking any legal action. When Marcus approached Chuck with his witnesses, the atmosphere immediately became more tense. Chuck demanded to know who the other men were and why Marcus had brought muscle to intimidate them. Marcus calmly explained that these were his relatives and friends, and they were there to witness the conversation. Marcus then delivered a formal notice that he had prepared with help from a lawyer friend. He read aloud that all persons on the property were trespassing and had until the end of the day to remove all belongings and leave the premises. He explained that failure to comply would result in legal action and involvement of law enforcement. The reaction was swift and angry. Big Jim stood up from his fishing chair and announced that Marcus was making a big mistake. He said that Marcus clearly didn't understand how things worked in their community, and that trying to kick out respected local people was going to backfire badly. Earl chimed in with threats about property values and how Marcus would never be accepted in the area if he continued down this path. Several of the women in the group joined in, accusing Marcus of being selfish and unreasonable. One older woman said that her family had been fishing this spot since she was a little girl, and it was heartless to try to take that away from people. A younger woman suggested that Marcus was probably just trying to make money off the property and didn't care about the community. Chuck took charge of the group's response. He told Marcus that they had consulted with people who knew about these things and determined that Marcus couldn't legally kick them out. He claimed they had established adverse possession rights through years of continuous use. He also mentioned again that local law enforcement would not support Marcus against longtime community members. Marcus had anticipated these arguments and had done his research. He calmly explained that adverse possession required much more than simply using someone's property for fishing. It required open, notorious, continuous, and hostile use for a specific number of years, along with paying property taxes. None of these conditions had been met. The legal discussion seemed to confuse and frustrate the group. They had clearly expected their bluffs about local connections and legal rights to intimidate Marcus into backing down. When he demonstrated actual knowledge of property law, their confidence began to waver noticeably. Marcus then played his strongest card. He announced that he had already contacted the county sheriff's office and filed a formal trespassing complaint. He had also contacted the state environmental agency about unpermitted use of lakefront property for commercial purposes. He had documentation of everything, including photos of the current gathering. Big Jim's face turned red as he realized Marcus was serious about legal action. He accused Marcus of being vindictive and unreasonable, saying that involving authorities was an escalation that would have consequences. Chuck tried to salvage the situation by offering to work something out and suggesting they could discuss a reasonable arrangement. Marcus had already decided he was past the point of negotiation. He told the group they had until sunset to remove all belongings and leave the property. After that, he would consider anyone remaining on the property to be trespassing and would take appropriate action. He also informed them that he would be installing security cameras and no trespassing signs throughout the property. As Marcus and his witnesses left, they could hear heated arguments breaking out among the fishing group. Some people were clearly angry about the situation escalating, while others seemed worried about the legal threats. Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He had finally taken a strong stand, but he knew the battle was far from over. Monday morning brought the first sign that the fishing group wasn't planning to give up quietly. Marcus received a phone call at work from someone claiming to be a lawyer representing the fishing club. The caller, who identified himself as Attorney Morrison, claimed that his clients had legal rights to use the property, and that Marcus was violating those rights by trying to exclude them. Marcus asked for specific details about these supposed legal rights, but the caller became vague and evasive. When Marcus requested that any legal claims be submitted in writing with proper documentation, Attorney Morrison became hostile and suggested that Marcus was making a mistake that would cost him significantly. The call ended with vague threats about lawsuits and legal consequences. Something about the call didn't feel right to Marcus. A legitimate lawyer would have provided specific legal citations and formal documentation, rather than making phone threats. Marcus decided to do some investigating. When he called the State Bar Association to verify Attorney Morrison's credentials, he discovered that no such lawyer was registered in the state. The fishing group had apparently hired someone to impersonate a lawyer and try to intimidate Marcus into backing down. This revelation made Marcus even more determined to stand his ground. If they were willing to resort to fraud and impersonation, they were clearly desperate and running out of legitimate options. That weekend, Marcus returned to his property to find that the fishing group had indeed cleared out most of their equipment. However, they had left behind a mess that looked almost intentional. Trash was scattered everywhere, the dock had been damaged, and someone had carved crude messages into several trees. It was clear this wasn't just normal cleanup neglect, but a deliberate attempt to damage his property out of spite. Marcus spent hours cleaning up beer cans, food containers, fishing line, and other debris. The dock had several loose boards and bent railings that would need repair. Most disturbing were the messages carved into his trees, including some that contained threats and profanity. The fishing group had apparently decided that if they couldn't use the property, they would make sure Marcus knew exactly how they felt about him. While cleaning up, Marcus discovered that the group had been using his property for much more than just fishing. Hidden behind some bushes, he found evidence of overnight camping, including fire rings and areas where tents had clearly been set up multiple times. They had essentially been running an unauthorized campground on his land without his knowledge or permission. Marcus documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. The evidence of camping without permits could potentially result in additional legal violations beyond simple trespassing. He also discovered that someone had been dumping fish cleaning waste directly into the lake, which violated environmental regulations. Tuesday brought another surprise. Marcus received a visit at his office from a county commissioner named Bob Patterson, who claimed he wanted to discuss the situation at Crystal Lake. Patterson explained that he had received complaints from several constituents about Marcus's treatment of the fishing group, and he hoped they could work out a reasonable compromise. Patterson suggested that Marcus was being unreasonable in excluding longtime residents from a traditional fishing spot. He mentioned that the county was always interested in promoting tourism and recreational activities, and that accommodating local fishing clubs was good for the community. He hinted that being seen as anti-community could affect Marcus's standing if he ever needed county services or permits. Marcus politely but firmly explained that this was a private property matter, not a county issue. He pointed out that the county commissioner had no authority over private property disputes and that his visit was actually inappropriate. When Patterson persisted in trying to pressure Marcus into allowing the fishing group to return, Marcus asked him to leave and suggested that any further contact should be through official channels. The commissioner's visit confirmed Marcus's suspicions about local politics and connections. Big Jim had apparently been working behind the scenes to use political pressure and intimidation to force Marcus to back down. The fact that a county official was willing to make unofficial visits to pressure a property owner showed just how entrenched this network of influence was. That evening, Marcus received another phone call, this time from someone claiming to be from the Lake Users Association, who wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss access rights. When Marcus asked for specific details about this organization, the caller became evasive and eventually hung up. Marcus was beginning to realize that the fishing group was running a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation. Marcus decided it was time to go on the offensive rather than just defending his position. He contacted a real lawyer who specialized in property rights and harassment cases. The lawyer confirmed that the fake attorney call, the property damage, and the inappropriate political pressure all constituted harassment and possibly criminal activity. The lawyer also explained that Marcus had multiple legal remedies available, including restraining orders, civil lawsuits for property damage, and criminal complaints for harassment and fraud. Most importantly, the lawyer assured Marcus that his property rights were absolute and that no amount of local political pressure could override his legal ownership. By the end of the week, Marcus had developed a comprehensive legal strategy. He was no longer just trying to keep trespassers off his property. He was preparing to take legal action against an organized group that had crossed the line from mere trespassing into harassment, fraud, and property damage. The fishing club had escalated the situation far beyond what Marcus had ever anticipated, but they had also given him the legal ammunition he needed to end the situation permanently. Marcus's lawyer, David Chen, wasted no time in taking action. Within a week, he had filed multiple legal documents that would force the phishing group to face the consequences of their escalating harassment campaign. The first was a comprehensive restraining order that named all 5 original members of the phishing group and prohibited them from coming within 500 feet of Marcus's property. The restraining order detailed the pattern of harassment, including the fake lawyer calls, property damage, and attempts at political intimidation. Chen had also included the evidence of environmental violations and unpermitted camping activities. The legal document painted a picture of an organized group that had systematically violated multiple laws while trying to intimidate a property owner. When the restraining orders were served, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Chuck called Marcus directly, screaming about lawyers and legal costs and threatening to make Marcus's life miserable. The call was so aggressive and threatening that Marcus recorded it on his phone. Chuck seemed to have no understanding that threatening someone who already had a restraining order against him was a criminal offense. Big Jim's response was more calculated, but equally revealing. He contacted Marcus through a mutual acquaintance, offering to call off the dogs if Marcus would agree to let the phishing group use the property on weekends. He portrayed the offer as a generous compromise, suggesting that Marcus should be grateful for the opportunity to avoid a prolonged legal battle. Marcus's response was to forward Big Jim's compromise offer directly to his lawyer. Chen pointed out that the offer was essentially an admission that Big Jim had been coordinating the harassment campaign. It also showed that the group still didn't understand that Marcus had no obligation to negotiate about his own property rights. The legal pressure began to have an effect within 2 weeks. Earl was the first to break ranks, contacting Marcus through a lawyer to apologize and request that his name be removed from the legal actions. His lawyer explained that Earl was a small business owner who couldn't afford to be involved in a lengthy legal battle that might affect his professional reputation. Earl's defection seemed to panic the others. The man with the expensive watch, who turned out to be named James Pollard rather than Big Jim, contacted Marcus to claim that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. He suggested that the group had never intended to cause problems and had simply been confused about property boundaries. Marcus's lawyer advised him that these contact attempts were actually violations of the restraining order, since they were attempts to pressure him into dropping legal action. Each phone call or message was documented as additional evidence of harassment. The phishing group seemed incapable of understanding. The continuing to contact Marcus only made their legal situation worse. The most satisfying development came when the county commissioner who had visited Marcus's office received an official complaint from the state ethics board. Marcus had filed a detailed report about the inappropriate political pressure, including the commissioner's attempt to influence a private property dispute. The ethics investigation would become a matter of public record and potentially affect the commissioner's political career. Chen also filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for property repair, cleanup costs, legal fees, and punitive damages for harassment. The lawsuit named not just the phishing group members but also anyone who had participated in the intimidation campaign. The financial exposure was significant enough to get serious attention from the defendants. The fake lawyer incident had the most serious consequences. The state attorney general's office opened a criminal investigation into the impersonation of an attorney, which was a felony offense. The phone records led investigators directly to Chuck, who had apparently paid a friend to make the threatening call while pretending to be a lawyer. Marcus received updates on the legal proceedings weekly, and each report showed the phishing group's position becoming more desperate. Their initial arrogance had been replaced by panic as they realized the serious legal and financial consequences of their actions. Several members had hired their own lawyers, which was creating conflicts within the group as each person tried to minimize their own exposure. The environmental violations investigation had also gained momentum. The state environmental agency had found evidence of illegal dumping, unpermitted camping, and damage to protected wetland areas. These violations carried substantial fines and potential criminal penalties. The phishing group had transformed a simple trespassing issue into a multi-agency investigation. By the end of the month, Marcus's lawyer reported that settlement discussions had begun. The phishing group's lawyers were indicating that their clients wanted to resolve all legal issues quickly and quietly. They were facing potential criminal charges, Civil lawsuits, ethics investigations, and environmental fines. Their coordinated harassment campaign had backfired spectacularly. Marcus felt a deep satisfaction as he reviewed the legal developments. The fishing group had assumed they could intimidate and outlast him through local connections and persistent harassment. Instead, their escalation had given him the evidence needed to pursue serious legal consequences. They had transformed themselves from simple trespassers into defendants in multiple legal actions. The lawyer advised Marcus that he was now in a position of complete strength. The fishing group needed his cooperation to avoid serious legal consequences, while he had no need to compromise on anything. After months of being dismissed and threatened, Marcus was finally in control of the situation. The settlement negotiations revealed just how completely the fishing group's position had collapsed. Their lawyers contacted David Chen with increasingly desperate offers, starting with proposals for limited access and ending with complete surrender and payment of all damages. The group that had once laughed at Marcus's property claims was now begging to avoid criminal prosecution and financial ruin. Chuck was in the worst position of all. The fake lawyer scheme had resulted in felony charges that carried potential jail time and substantial fines. His business license was under review, and his family was facing financial pressure from legal costs. He went from being the group's intimidating leader to a desperate man trying to avoid prison. The final settlement terms were more comprehensive than Marcus had ever imagined possible. Each member of the fishing group was required to pay substantial monetary damages to cover property repairs, legal costs, and punitive damages. The total amount was enough for Marcus to completely renovate his property and install professional security systems. More importantly, the settlement included permanent restraining orders that prohibited any of the fishing group members from ever setting foot on Marcus's property again. They were also prohibited from encouraging or assisting anyone else in trespassing on the property. Violation of these terms would result in immediate criminal prosecution and additional financial penalties. The environmental violations resulted in separate fines and a requirement that the fishing group pay for professional, environmental remediation of the lake area. They had to fund the cleanup of years of illegal dumping and camping damage. The State Environmental Agency used the case as an example. In their educational materials about the importance of respecting private property and environmental regulations, County Commissioner Patterson faced his own consequences. The ethics investigation resulted in official censure and a requirement that he undergo training on the proper limits of his authority. The incident became a local political scandal that effectively ended his chances for re-election. His inappropriate attempt to pressure Marcus had destroyed his own political career. The fake lawyer incident resulted in criminal convictions for both Chuck and his friend who had made the intimidating phone call. Chuck received a suspended jail sentence, substantial fines, and community service. His conviction also resulted in the loss of his business license and professional certifications. The man who had tried to intimidate Marcus through fake legal threats was now a convicted felon. Marcus used the settlement money to transform his inherited property into something his grandfather would have been proud of. He hired contractors to rebuild the dock, install proper lighting and security cameras, and create beautiful landscaping. The property became a peaceful retreat that he could enjoy without worrying about harassment or trespassing. Word of Marcus's legal victory spread throughout the local community. The story became a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting property rights and the dangers of trying to intimidate property owners through harassment and political pressure. Other property owners in the area reported that their own trespassing problems had decreased significantly after news of the fishing group's defeat became public. Marcus also discovered that his legal victory had earned him respect in the community. People who had initially been skeptical of the outsider who challenged longtime residents came to appreciate his determination to stand up for his rights. Local business owners and other property owners began to view him as someone who wouldn't back down from bullies or corruption. The fishing group members became cautionary examples in their own community. Their transformation from respected local figures to convicted harassers and environmental criminals showed how quickly arrogance and entitlement could lead to serious consequences. Several lost their professional licenses, business relationships, and community standing. Marcus began spending more time at the lake property, using it as a weekend retreat and eventually considering it as a potential permanent residence. The peace and beauty that had attracted his grandfather were now his to enjoy without interference. He set up a small office in the renovated cabin and found he could work remotely while enjoying the lakefront environment. 1 year after the settlement, Marcus reflected on how much had changed. He had inherited a property he knew nothing about and been immediately challenged by people who assumed he was too weak to defend his rights. Their attempts to intimidate and humiliate him had backfired completely, transforming him from an uncertain property owner into someone confident in standing up for himself. The fishing group had taught Marcus an invaluable lesson about the importance of responding firmly to bullying and harassment. Their escalating attempts to pressure him had only made their own situation worse while strengthening his legal position. They had assumed that persistence and local connections would overcome property rights and legal authority, but they had been completely wrong. Marcus's Crystal Lake property became a symbol of the principle that property rights and legal protections are stronger than local politics and intimidation tactics. The fishing group had learned too late that underestimating someone's determination and legal resources can lead to consequences far worse than simply respecting their rights in the first place.